And welcome into this edition of Indian Time here on MuskogeeMedia.com. Jason Salzman, along with media coordinator Miss Jessica McBride. And Jessica, we wanted to start this week off a rainy Monday, so a little bit of doom and gloom out there. But we want to bring a little sunshine to our citizens' lives by giving an update on all the things that happened at this past week's National Council meeting, and we have lots to talk about, Jessica. I think the one thing that we lead off with from this past week's council meeting, regular session, is the council house, the amendment for the council house that was proposed to be able to find a way to fund some of the needed repairs to the council house, and as well as having some tax credits, some things tied up to it where it makes it a really good move. But I think that was probably the top thing coming out because everybody has been wondering about the council house.
Right. The National Council passed an appropriation of $2.5 million for council house improvements. Secretary of the Interior Chris Asbell for Creek Nation discussed that we're going to get about $1 million back or potentially $1 million back in tax credits, and that tax credit will also be used towards the council house.
When we had initially discovered this story and things kind of falling apart over there and really it really needing the improvements, not just for aesthetic sake, but just the structure itself. I mean, nothing can happen to that place because it's so important to us as a history of the people and the city of Okmulgee, really, and our standing here as the Great Muskogee Creek Nation here in the capital city. But, those were things that we talked about from the get-go. When we were doing the story, we were talking with Chris and others about the fact that there are avenues out there to where this can be saved and we can make it work for everybody. And I think they feel like they probably caught on to one of those avenues, and I think everybody feels really good about it. What was the vote, actually? I think it was unanimous.
It passed unanimously, so there wasn't anybody that voted against it.
Right. Okay, and that might be a tough to answer if you did vote against it, just because on the surface, you really don't want to be seen as the councilman that voted against the council house. But definitely everybody taking a look there and seeing and making sure there's an agreement that everybody could work with. And that's great news, and we'll have more coverage on that as time goes by on MuskogeeMedia.com, Muskogee Nation News, and on Native News Today television program. Moving right along and switching gears, maybe a not such good news, but maybe more controversial, I think you could say. The bill number TR 16-061 concerning the election process. This has been a really hot topic amongst our people from back in November, before the elections, when sort of the amendment came forward to bring in the Carter Center. Now, for the folks out there that don't know, Jimmy Carter has the Carter Center Foundation, which comes in and basically makes sure that elections in places are conducted the right way, and that there's no funny business going on with elections and things like that. At the time, there was a large section of citizens that were like, oh, this is great, we want to see this. Probably about the same amount, maybe just as much, saying, what? We don't need anybody to come in and look at our elections. So it was definitely a hot topic, which brings us to now. And it appears that a substitution has been put into this bill, and it passed, the substitution coming in pretty late, but it essentially takes out the Carter Center, Jessica.
Right. The original legislation formed a committee of 5 members, 2 from the principal chief, 2 from the National Council, and 1 from the Carter Center. That legislation was introduced in March. This substitute bill, which was passed on Saturday, takes that 5th member from the Carter Center and makes it a designee from the election board.
Right.
Now, this board will review the electoral process. They're supposed to have monthly meetings that are open to the citizens. We don't know when yet those meetings will be scheduled. And then they will create monthly reports for the principal chief, the attorney general, the second chief, National Council, and the election board, so that they can make recommendations to update our electoral process.
Yeah, like I said, monthly meetings. They'll report to the council quarterly, and a quorum is only it can be established with 3 of the 5 members. So we know sometimes it's hard to get schedules together. But looking at it from a citizen's perspective, you could say, well, let's just put on the glasses of, I'm looking at this and I want to be critical of this, this substitution. I would say as a citizen, you go, well, we want the election board to designate somebody to look after the job that they're performing? I mean, some people would say, no, we want a third party. We want somebody to come in that's not inside the system to look at it from this is our first day on the job type of deal. We're just looking at your policies, your procedures, and the execution of those. I think that's what citizens that are not going to be fans of this would say, right?
Well, that, and they bring in the question of sovereignty too, and it just that's why this piece of legislation is somewhat controversial, and it didn't actually pass unanimously. It passed 13-2 with Representatives Dodie Barnett and Joyce Deere voting against it.
Have we talked to Joyce or Dodie about that?
We haven't talked to Representative Deere. We have talked to Representative Barnett, and she said that, the election board is a constitutional agency and therefore independent, and she felt like this overstepped those bounds.
Right. And I think, this will be something that the people will talk about, even though it did pass. I think this will be something that the citizens will have a look at, and definitely we know that there will be a lot of opinion on this legislation. It'll be something to look at. But the Carter Center essentially being striked out of the original bill, and it instead being replaced with the designee from the election board themselves. So
there's a couple of other things to note on this too. It does say that the board can consult with an election monitoring service, and it also says that they're supposed to have their final recommendations to chief and second chief in the National Council and the AG's office by January 1st, 2017. So this isn't going to be a year-long process. They've got a few months, to kind of get organized and get things reviewed before they have to make their final determination.
Another thing we're trying to take a look at from this past week's council meeting is some of the confirmations. And what do we have to let everybody out there know about some of the confirmations that came before?
Well, there were two to the One Fire Holding Company board. Glenn Bunny passed 14-1 with Representative Deere voting against it. We've reached out to Representative Deere, but haven't heard anything back. The other one for the One Fire Holding Company board is Tara Branson, and she passed unanimously. Yeah,
and from my knowledge of the situations, Mr. Bunny is not a Creek citizen. That may be something. I don't want to speak for Miss Deere at all, but that may be something that's holding that up. And then with Tara Branson, just personally, I've known Tara and worked with her being at NCAI, National Congress of American Indians. I think it's a good choice. I think some citizens, would like to see a little bit more of an open process as far as the confirmation names being put forth and just the process as a whole. That's something that we'll probably need to keep an eye on and see where that develops and whatnot. But both of those being confirmed to the board there, and the One Fire board, I believe, as we've talked to them before, Sean Copeland and such in our interviews before, most of the board is Creek citizens, and I think only just a couple maybe are not. So definitely a Creek representation with that board, and a vested interest in the investments they're making for the Creek people. Speaking of one such investment, it will be opening June 7th, the Flying T. So I know they're all excited about that. And Tara and Mr. Bunny coming in at a really exciting time there. So they got lots of work to do, though.
There was one more nomination, too. Kathleen Supernaw was nominated back to the Supreme Court. Okay. In our research, she's been on the Muskogee Creek Nation Supreme Court since May 2010, I believe. And that piece of legislation passed unanimously. It's also probably important to note that all of these, except that we've discussed, besides the One Fire Board nominations, will have to go to the principal chief for signature before they are approved.
Any observations as a journalist from the meeting, being there, anything catch your eye or anything that
it was an interesting meeting. One of the things that Speaker Lucian Tiger brought up is, I guess they've been getting questions from citizens about discussing things in the general session, and he did bring up that the committee sessions are held, and that's when they do a lot of the discussions. If you're interested, you can go to those meetings. Those agendas are posted online, or the audio from those meetings are posted online at mcnnc.com, so you can listen to those, or you can listen and watch the general sessions too.
Right. We've posted stories and reported on issues directly from audio from some of these committee meetings. It's a tremendous resource for us, and it could be an incredible resource for our citizens too that have access to the audio recordings. And you're right, Speaker Tiger's right. In the committee is really when they break down the bills and sort of talk about them, get them ready for the regular session agenda and whatnot. Because I think the thinking there is you don't get to the Saturday and you're there all day long with discussion and whatnot and bringing people up, and that's kind of what the committee meetings are for. That's why they're segmented and sort of staggered the way that they are.
Well, and they do those interviews too with excuse me, the individuals that the legislation concerns, and so that's when you actually get the discussion and you get council reps asking questions of those individuals to find out whether or not they will vote for or vote against it.
Yeah.
And another thing to note too is on the National Council website they do have the full legislation. It's a little bit difficult to get to, but they do post it with the agendas, so you can review the full legislation, and then if you have questions, reach out to that representative.
Wonderful. All right. Well, that all of those topics that we're discussing will be included in council coverage in the June 15th edition of the Muskogee Nation News. Also, extensive coverage of these topics on MuskogeeMedia.com, including interviews, commentary, reports, and our social media too. So MuskogeeMedia.com, Facebook, Muskogee Nation News, Native News Today. Stay up with all of it as we continue to bring you coverage of not only the happenings of day-to-day goings on in the Muskogee Creek Nation government, but what they're doing on a regular session at a regular session pace. We are keeping up with all of that. So, and also we've talked about bringing in a not only the speaker, but maybe a different councilman every time to sort of break down and have kind of a post-game show of each meeting, so that the citizens can hear directly from their council on how the meeting went and their observations of it as well. I think it'd be a great resource for the citizens.
I think so too.
All right, Jessica. Well, thanks for being with me here on this week's version of Indian Time. Always keep it on MuskogeeMedia.com and all of our outlets to keep up with what's going on in the nation. And we'll see you guys for the next one.